Well, thank you for joining us for the Wild Ones Native Garden Design Series. My name is Dave Nye, and I'll be your host for this discussion. I've been a Wild Ones member since 2020, and I belong to the Illinois Lake to Prairie chapter. I'm honored to be talking today with Donald Pell, who's the designer of the Wild Ones Philadelphia Native Garden Design. So for those of you who are new to Wild Ones, we're a membership organization devoted to promoting the use of native plants to create sustainable landscapes. We carry out our mission through educational programs and resource offerings such as the Wild Ones Journal, Native Garden Designs, Seeds for Education Grant, and educational workshops and webinars. At the local level, Wild Ones chapters offer programs including garden tours, speakers, conferences, native plant sales, and seed exchanges. Wild Ones has over 100 new and established chapters in 29 states across the U.S. If you're not a Wild Ones member, we hope you'll join us and take advantage of the support and community of being part of a local chapter. Our critical mission needs you. Wild Ones chapters are where members put our mission into action, get their hands dirty, and learn by doing. Chapters are actively recruiting chapter officers and volunteers. Chapter activities require the time and talents of many different people to coordinate. Amplify the impact you have in the native plant movement by sharing your skills and enthusiasm with others. Please reach out to your local chapter to find out how you can get involved. But what if there isn't a chapter near you? We ask that you please consider starting a Wild Ones seedling chapter in your area. Chapter founders across the country connect and collaborate with one another for mutual support and guidance. If you're eager to advance Wild Ones' mission and cultivate a community of support for native plants in your area, visit the Start a Chapter page on the Wild Ones website. Wild Ones inspires and empowers people in communities across the country to transform home landscapes into vibrant and essential habitats for all forms of life. Programs like this would not be possible without generous support from our members, donors, and folks like you viewing this Wild Ones program. Please consider donating to Wild Ones today by visiting wildones.org. Wild Ones Native Garden Designs follows the premise that native plant landscaping can be beautiful, beneficial, and achievable for gardeners of all skill sets in terms of scope and budget. This program contains resources that include information on how to get started by identifying your ecoregion, selecting and determining plant placement in your yard, considering your own specific climate conditions, and finding local native plant nurseries in your area. The program also features a growing number of free, downloadable native garden designs created by professional landscape designers representing various ecoregions in the United States. A plant list accompanies each design and provides a quick preview of the diversity and beauty of the native plants incorporated in the design, as well as a phased installation approach, all of which can be downloaded and printed easily at home. All designs are assembled using native plants that provide habitat and food for wildlife that offer a colorful and beautiful garden throughout the growing season. We hope these resources inspire, encourage, and motivate you on your native garden journey. So today we are honored to have designer Donald Pell, owner of Donald Pell Gardens Landscape Designs in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, with us today to share his creative insights on his approach to preparing the site, selecting plants, and designing home landscapes in Philadelphia. For over 25 years, Donald Pell has been reshaping landscapes throughout the United States, eastern United States, by juxtaposing what we know with the unexpected to create an endless wonder of visual possibility. With a focus on adventurous, immersive placemaking, his naturalistic designs magnify beauty through the masterful connections between stunning plants, hardscape, and sculptural features. Donald Pell's landscapes have won top design awards from the Perennial Plant Association, the Association of Professional Landscape Designers, and most recently a silver medal in his first ever appearance at the Philadelphia Flower Show. His designs have been finalists on HGTV's Ultimate Outdoor Awards and featured in several publications, including Grow, Garden Design, and Parents magazines. Situated on a 14-acre farm in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, Don's studio garden has been a frequent destination for new American garden design enthusiasts and horticultural educational groups from around the world. Donald, thank you for joining us and sharing your talent and expertise with the Wild Ones community today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about plants.
Great. So for those of us who are less familiar with the Philadelphia area, could you share some typical weather and climate conditions, the seasons, temperatures, weather patterns, and experience in your area?
I'd say, we have temps that go from the very low teens up into the high 90s, and that those temperatures can tend to hold for several weeks on end. I believe we have about 36 inches of rainfall a year. And although we've had significant periods of drought as well, just anecdotally, I've noticed the last several years, we've definitely had more extended periods of heat and extended periods of dry. We've also had multiple rainfalls the last couple of years where we're having several inches of rainfall in a year, which is pretty extreme. We had one recently that was 4 inches, and the sidewalks actually lifted up and floated away, which is pretty interesting. In some communities, it's exciting for sure. We're having to think more and more about plant selections and programmatic decisions. Yeah.
That kind of leads into my next question, that somebody new to your area or unfamiliar with your area, what kind of things would they have to consider for a native garden to thrive in that ecoregion? And what's it like to garden with native plants in the Philadelphia area, taking all that climate information you just shared into consideration?
I think with most gardening, the thing that amateurs and hobbyists who are just getting into gardening miss is the density that you want to typically plant with. There's potential for superficial and extreme erosion if you're not really thinking about stabilizing the ground plane, which, when done properly, I think the gardens are more beautiful. They feel more natural. They start to function more naturally. They do things like suppress weeds better, which, especially here in the mid-Atlantic, working in these natural gardens, that's definitely one of the challenges of these gardens. Not only the plants that tend to be weeds, but the desirable plants that even can tend to be weeds. And what I mean by that is, these prairie style gardens, they move pretty quickly, especially in sunny areas here in the Piedmont, in the mid-Atlantic. Plants tend to want to replicate quickly. And so understanding kind of the competitive natures of plants are something you start to learn later on in the field, and realize that if you want diversity in the garden, you will need to start to edit the garden even in time, because you can have plants really take over. If, for instance, if you were to plant something like Scutellaria and Canna next to Asclepias tuberosa, you're not going to have your Asclepias tuberosa for very long. The competitive natures of those plants are out of balance, right? So we want to plant densely. I like diversity a lot, but we need to start thinking about how plants evolve. So as dense as we want the garden plantings to be, we're not left with monocultures in the future, which can happen as well. But that's the exciting part of gardening, I think. It's not, the anxiety some folks might have early on about, I'm not sure about this. I think the real opportunity is to live a life that that you're always learning and you're always seeing new things. And that to me is what's really exciting about this field I get to work in, and watching, secession to some degree take place.
Yeah.
But for sure, trying to stabilize the ground plane as quickly as possible can only be a benefit, especially with a challenging environment
Yeah.
like we have.
Yeah, yeah. Weed pressure is something that we're all battling in pretty much all parts of the country, I would imagine. Getting back to you mentioned a few things about climate in the area. So, most of the U.S. has experienced some degree of change in the climate in the last 20 years. Um, other than the excessive rain and periods of drought that you've seen, are there any other conditions that you've observed over time in your area?
Um, any other environmental conditions?
Yeah, climate conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's just that it's the extreme swings that we see that, um, we really have to be mindful of plants that were once endemic to the mid-Atlantic are now retracting north. Plants like the sugar maple, and we don't plant a lot of those plants for clients because of the extreme heat and how those plants are not responding well anymore. But I'm not saying I've given up on them altogether. We have North Slopes. I think it's worth considering a plant like that. Um, I think it's just really looking for resilient plants, and even in our seed selecting, if we're growing a lot of Echinacea purpurea from seed, we're looking to select out plants that look more robust from those seed strains, because ideally they're the things that are going to respond better to stresses. Um, but it really is just kind of the extremes we're experiencing, whether that be heat or rainfall. The periods of dry are also pretty extreme. However, I feel like if you get plants established here in the Mid-Atlantic in their proper locations, most of those plants can be pretty resilient in extreme dry periods of dry.
Yeah.
But that's also a great opportunity to learn. If you're going out there with the hose all the time and having the water, you probably either have a soil compaction issue or you've poorly sited some plants, and perhaps just a little work there, either moving plants or improving the soil conditions could be your friend, for sure. So
Yeah.
we really want to think about proper plant placement as well. That's critical.
Yeah, right. The right plant in the right place is key.
Yeah, exactly.
So what can a homeowner do in their own landscaping to help mitigate some of those climate effects? It's a small scale, but on a small scale, what could they do in their own home landscaping?
Sure. I mean, the design we worked with is a pretty small scale, and so the things I think about is cooling, right? And so if you could get trees on the deciduous trees on the south side of your home, you have the benefit of cooling, and then allowing light to come through in the winter after that tree defoliates. And I think even something as simple as that is really beneficial. But just tree canopy in general, I think often we're not thinking about enough, and and whether it's um, deciduous material that's just cooling your home or out around the landscape. I think that's a really beneficial to do for the local ecology. We are really heating up, and I think the more we can increase canopy in this country is a really positive thing. If you have a larger property and you could do a windbreak on the northwest of your home with deciduous trees, that can also be extremely beneficial, right? But I may have said deciduous, I mean evergreens. And,
Yeah.
those evergreens, however, do get large. And so doing that on a quarter acre is probably not practical. But on a larger property, an evergreen windbreak can be extremely helpful. And then just in general, I think, densely planting, I'll beat that drum forever. We're not planting densely enough. If you're, a lot of you folks are from the Midwest and up in Wisconsin. And if you see those natural grasslands and prairies, those remnant prairies, the density and diversity per square meter is really impressive compared to what you typically see in the home garden. And often we have folks come to us and say, "Oh, should the plants be touching?" Or they're going to crowd each other out. And I think the number I've heard in a remnant prairie, you might have as many as 40 species per square meter. Well, look at your own garden. Do you have anything even remotely close to that? And so I think, dense planting is helping cool the earth, sequestering carbon, can cool your residence, proper planting of deciduous trees. There's so much that can be done. Again, I think on a small residence level, I think it's exciting, to bring that to your own home for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So looking at the design a little bit here, you've got it rendered in some, pretty colorful renderings there. Can you kind of walk us through and how you envision the experience of being in this particular garden?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, we want people to come to a home and really get the sense they're in a romantic place or a very sensory filled place. And to me, that's about engagement with the plants, and not just using plants as, decorating a home, kind of the quintessential parsley around the turkey. It's about, using plants to define a place. And for me, that's really immersing myself in plants. I love that. I grew up with a big, what we called a field behind our home. And that's where I spent all my years playing, whether it was the creek I would wander down to without, my mother being able to find me on a cell phone or scream to me. I was gone for hours on end, playing in this creek, in this grassland, and often coming home with poison ivy. But who cared? We were just having the best life. And now when I think about being in a place that really affects me, it's a place that I'm immersed in the experience of plants. And that's very much what this is. It's kind of coming home to a walkway and kind of a plaza or patio area that we really didn't call out what could happen there. But, that could be a place for some kind of features or plants or an herb garden. And then continuing to circulate right through that property where you're really having a visceral reaction to the plants, a romantic engagement with plants, and plants along the way that are blooming at different times of the year. But that's even a very ephemeral quality of plants. Often we think, oh, what's the flower? That's almost one of the last things I think about. I think about textures and forms and autumn colors, and that constant evolution of plants is really exciting to me. So just this whole experiential kind of lifestyle of living in a garden, having moments where there'll be shade and moments where there'll be sun, where you can be and kind of explore through where there'll be kind of the negative space of lower textures on the ground plane, and then these overhead architectural planes that might kind of compress you through a threshold. And we have some of these in the rear garden. We have some of these shade trees that hopefully in time would do that, right? And that's all a very, again, I hate to use the same word, but a very romantic experience, right? There's just these different emotions that one hopefully will experience from day to day walking through that place. And this is just who I am. I get really excited about moving through my own garden multiple times a day and seeing how things change all the time. And that's really what I'm trying to forward as an idea to folks. Don't feel like you need tons of turf grass. Is that really a sexy way to live? I don't know. It's just it's not very emotive to me, but the idea of seeing something new all the time and experiencing something new all the time and bringing the birds and the butterflies, right to your patio and right to your windows. We have aronia growing out of my office windows, and I'm like a kid at Christmas every winter when the eastern bluebird comes right to our windows and eats the aronia berries. They laugh at me here in the office because I get so excited about that, and that's how we set up our plants, because we're inside a little more in the winter. And but even when we're having to work in the office, I love looking out through plantings. I love to walk through the garden and have that emotive experience. And so that's kind of the whole program for this as well. And to nestle in some features like rain gardens that will really be a seamless part of the garden. There's nothing that I think is less appealing than like a rain garden stuck out in a suburban lawn. It just feels very discordant to me. But if you just seamlessly integrate those features into a garden, where maybe the plant selections just change a little bit to accommodate things like facultative wetlands that would be the bottom of the rain garden, which will still tolerate more mesic soils, and you could bleed those plants out into the landscape. That's what we're really trying to forward as an idea. It's just one integrated system.
Sure.
And that's how I'm kind of thinking about this garden for people.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, just the movement and the change from morning to night and the change through the seasons from day to day. That's definitely something to keep in mind, and makes it interesting year round. So you mentioned turf grass, and a lot of us are trying to eliminate as much turf grass as possible. So is there a native? I mean, if we need an open space that's got a turf-like look to it, is there a native that you recommend for that you use?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it depends if you're in shade, looking at plants like if it's drier shade, you could look at different sedges, maybe even Carex albicans, or if it's kind of a lower lying rich area, maybe Carex pennsylvanica. If it's a sunnier spot, maybe buffalo grass, beautiful warm season native grass is Bouteloua, I think it's dactyloides. And in that you can mix in some native ephemeral bulbs even. I'm forgetting our little native pink woodland bulb, but
Spring Beauty?
Integrating things in like that. I'm sorry?
Spring Beauty, you said?
Yeah, right. Spring Beauty, which I was trying to think of the genus. I know it begins with a C, but it'll come to me as soon as we're done talking. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say if you're trying to do something like that, just going with a monoculture. I mean, if you can add some diversity into that as well, would be great. But I think, trying to reduce that turf grass down until whether it's turf grass or kind of a lawn path, a native lawn path. I think just trying to reduce it down to just what your functional needs are. I mean, I'm kind of far left of center when it comes to my comfort level with wild plants, but I recognize some people don't want to be crowded by some of these more emergent layers of herbaceous plants, and so maybe being generous. But that's all going to be a personal thing. And when we design gardens for people, we're trying to get to the core of what their needs are and how they live. But I think there's a host of different plants to consider out there for sure.
Okay. Well, you kind of touched on rain gardens a little bit, so that's actually the next topic we're going to cover here. Can you tell us about rain gardens and utilization of rainwater storage and whatever in the wet autumns and springs in Pennsylvania? And is it something that's common out there?
Yeah, the more and more municipalities are mandating infiltration systems because of all the impervious and all the building that's happened in the Mid-Atlantic and definitely in Pennsylvania. And so the DEP has allowed in their BMP manual for biological infiltration systems like vegetated swales and rain gardens. And so as opposed to just doing a conventional seepage pit, we're often able to design vegetated swales or rain gardens in particular. The whole plan is to take stormwater off of existing infrastructure, right? We're not treating this as a waste product anymore. We're thinking about water as an amenity. And now on a small residence, you can even grow things like different sedges or rushes, Chelone lioni, Asclepsia incarnata. It's more like a wetland plant, different asters and Brunonias, right? I think the important thing is to try to have those systems look like they integrate into the overall garden when they're just these big emergent plants. For instance, on a residence like this, if we were to plant Vernonia novaboreensis, the New York ironweed, which is a spectacularly beautiful plant, but if you were to specify that in a rain garden here, it's going to seed in and take over even in the drier sections of the garden and run over every plant in your garden eventually, right? So we want to think about design and integration of those systems and the planting for those systems. That's really important. Too often, and even now, we've seen folks want to adopt these systems or builders, and we see a rain garden out into this vast expanse of suburban lawn, and they just look like big sore thumbs, and so they're just not accepted by the public. And this is where folks like me tend to come into play. Hopefully we have good ideas like integrating these into an overall design, and so they'll be more well received. But again, there's a different selection of plants, which adds more diversity to your garden. And I think that there's only opportunities when it comes to capturing stormwater on your property, where it really becomes an amenity for homeowners. And whether that's mandated because of stormwater, or you just want to be a good neighbor and start to take some of the pressure off your local infrastructure. We've done that before, where there's been really old retaining walls, stone retaining walls. There was no mandate by any local or government for permitting, but we were adding impervious. And so we just felt like the right thing to do was try to capture and infiltrate some of the stormwater, to reduce the potential of those systems, those walls failing in the future. And I think it's always worth thinking about, water as a hazard and as an amenity, for sure.
So in the design that you have for Wild Ones, you've got multiple rain gardens incorporated in it. Yes. With a lot of grasses and flowering plants, milkweed, iris, bee balm. So I'm kind of combining a couple questions here. Can you explain why those plants are suited for a rain garden and how they function to absorb the water, and how, why those particular plants are good for a rain garden.
Sure. Well, again, we're looking at facultative plants and upland plants, because you're going to have the bank of the rain garden as well. So we want to mix, and then some years we're going to have years that are drier than others. So you're going to have this kind of elastomeric quality to the planting as well. Some years might be drier, and plants like Monarda bradburyana might seed into the edges more aggressively. And then you might have a wetter year, and the iris fulva might start to, spread out rhizomes into those areas on a drier year. We're looking at plants that have a host of different ways to replicate themselves, right? So it's either by root division of rhizomes, and maybe they're disturbed by animals in the ground. Plants like the iris, of course, are growing on rhizomes. And then there's plants that would seed out into the landscape and disperse themselves freely, like Conoclinum colostinium, or they used to call it Eupatorium colostinium, or Monarda bradburyana. They would self-sow freely and fill in the gaps. The forbs are particularly helpful because they sow out aggressively early on, while the sedges and grasses are a little slower to come on. They'll eventually push out the forbs until there's disturbance in nature. That would be fire. We typically don't allow that in a residential neighborhood, of course. But we want to mix the forbs and the grasses and sedges, and again, plants' ability to replicate themselves and think about how they will. So there's a lot of this kind of ability to stabilize the ground plane through self-regeneration, depending on what happens from year to year. And that's really the magic of plants. They've kind of they've been set up perfectly for years of drought, years of wet, fire, just animal disturbance. It's really exciting when you start to think about it. And we're thinking about the rain gardens in very much the same way. What could happen from year to year? Let's add diversity. But again, we're not adding a plant like Vernonia that is going to tolerate, a facultative wetland plant because of how highly competitive it might be amongst, in a small system like this. So I'm not trying to discourage people from building because they don't know all the plants. The excitement is just get plants in the ground. You're going to learn through observation better than any, master's in horticulture program in the world. No offense to the University of Sheffield or anything like that, but the real way to learn is by seeing. And so I can only encourage people. And truth be told, I have no formal education in this. I've been working with plants since my mother had a nursery, and I started my business in 19, and it was just out of sheer enthusiasm of putting plants in the ground and learning about them. At 40, I just turned 49 years old. I'm really, I'm starting to understand plants a little bit now, finally. It takes forever, but it's fun. So yeah. Go have some fun,
Yeah, nature's giving you the formal education.
Yeah, for sure.
So in a rain garden, let's say a homeowner has planted it, maybe not all the right plants, like you're saying, just get plants in the ground. Should they be worried if there are periods of drought? I mean, I think a lot of people think rain garden, I need wetland plants. Is that necessarily the case? Because they are going to dry out.
They will, and again, if properly planted, those plants can tolerate a fair amount of dry, and they can tolerate, if they're facultative wetland plants, for sure, they can tolerate inundation, long periods of inundation. Beyond the rain garden, I would say you know, we don't love to build gardens with irrigation systems, especially in a climate that produces 36 inches of rainfall a year. Um, it can be helpful for establishment periods for sure. And proper irrigation is really important. You know, deep watering, more duration of watering, less frequency of watering, right? We want to push water down through the ground plane. We want the roots to chase it, not stay up high in the profile because they're constantly getting water. So again, I think the opportunity is to learn, you know, to step back from your garden and look at it. It's extremely dry. Maybe I just cut back some of those plants now, and you know, especially herbaceous plants, they can take extreme, you know, pruning back. And if you get moisture again, those plants will generally push back in the same year and look cleaner. Um, you know, I want these gardens to look curated and to be accepted by the general public. And so there is a kind of an editing process that happens and a curating process that happens. But to start off, I would say, no, don't be scared, you know, be excited, go out there and put plants in the ground, put more plants in the ground. And if it needs some watering the first couple of years because you know you've experienced extreme drought, well, you know, I don't think personally it's the worst thing to do a big watering in the middle of the summer once every few years, just so your plants look acceptable to you and to you know, the neighborhood's not mad at you that you know the garden looks like a weed pit. We still want it to be acceptable. You know, we want to see more people um, you know, be inspired by these types of systems. And you know, again, I think there's nothing wrong with some human intervention, you know, as time goes on. And quite frankly, it's necessary for sure.
Okay. All right. Well, moving on to plant selection. So how does this design that you provided support and preserve plant and wildlife species that are native to the local ecosystem?
Sure. You know, look, diversity is key, right? And so we have things like hackberry, which will produce fruit that as it rots, the flies will come on. And I'm not talking about, you know, bringing in the locust. You know, I'm talking about very small flies that then the birds will go after and eat. And so we're starting to establish some of that kind of cycle of that happens in evolution, or I'm sorry, in ecology. There's plants like the spiros or the persimmon, which has some of the same effect. And for sure, I mean, often I think the mistake is we think about them and us, right? There's the birds and the Lepidoptera, and then there's us. But I'm always thinking about human engagement. I want people to be delighted by these plants. I want you to be able to go out and eat pawpaw or persimmon. I think that's really important. So these places become beloved by people, and they want to continue to have them and nurture them and be stewards of these places. We certainly have we have oaks and a host of other deciduous trees that Lepidoptera are going to utilize and feed off of. Plants like Cornus alternifolia, the understory plants. Same thing. These are all very beneficial to Lepidoptera, which again in host will be host plants for Lepidoptera and then provide food for the songbirds. I mentioned the aronia, the chokeberry, which the eastern bluebird loves. We have vaccinium, which again, you know, the high bush blueberry beyond being a great source of food for birds, clearly humans can consume it, but just for the same the sheer fact that it's a beautiful plant, I love to integrate that in our gardens. You know, it has this beautiful exfoliating bark and a beautiful blush flower in the spring and the most spectacular scarlet foliage in the autumn. You know, it's like the trifecta of beauty, and then you bring the birds in, right? So really spectacular. Yeah, again, I just think it's the diversity of plantings. The asters are spectacular for the butterflies, the phlox. Um, uh, you know, again, I think it just comes down to, if you don't know, uh, make it more diverse. You know, because monocultures are just really not the friends of ecology. And that's what we're really looking at, you know, kind of a host of different native plants that'll be stable in the landscape and allow for some of those interactions from local fauna for sure.
Yeah. So a diversity of species, but also in the plan, there's a lot of flexibility in the placement of and arrangement of them, kind of a randomized pattern. And so what do you think are some of the advantages of planting in that way?
Well, again, you know, all these plants have different ways to replicate themselves, right? So if there's stresses in the landscape that might knock out something, especially early on, maybe there's neglect or there's some disturbance from an animal. These other plants, because of they're so randomized, I think have a much greater ability to fill in those spaces, you know, spontaneously. So I think that's probably the biggest. You know, we're seeing some rust in our native panicum, and you know, if you're purely going for a look, and that's a very stylized look, and you know, we do see a pathogen or a virus come into an area, now you're left with really big holes in the landscape. And you know, I think diversity in general is a really good thing, especially when we're thinking about ecology. And when you can keep that diversity simpler, I do think, you know, there's something to be said for that. It doesn't look like we went to the nursery at the end of the year and bought one of everything, and the colors start to get clashy, and you know, the forms start to get you know, extreme. So I think keeping that composition can be, you know, simple, can be a little easier to accept for the general public who might not have a lot of comfort level with these natural or naturalistic plantings, right? So my goal is not to only build for people who grew up in fields like I did and they're totally comfortable with that. I really want, you know, to try to engage the general public and do it in a way that they feel comfortable in these places, and they're maybe more inclined to start adopting them. And so I think random is good, but simplification can also be good. And you know, finding that balance. And I'll say also that, you know, I'm a garden enthusiast and a plant enthusiast, and so I want to try a host of different plants, and I think that's okay. And I think it's okay for new gardeners to start adding plants into the mix, and from there they're going to become more informed and they're going to edit those gardens as they see fit in time. So there's no perfect way to do this. You know, this is kind of a simple model for some ideas I want to forward to people in the hopes that they will try them. You know, often we've put plantings around walkways and things, and people thought, oh, you know, that's too much. It's too many trees. And then, you know, they start to live in a garden like that and they're delighted by it. And we see that more times than not. But that's really what I'm after, you know, diversity and maybe a little bit of simplification at the same time. I mean, they seem like exclusive ideas, but you know, they're not. You know,
Yeah.
you can have diversity and simplification at the same time.
Yeah. So you call it the impressionistic style um, versus a traditional style. And you kind of touched on how that feels different. I mean, and people may push against it in the beginning, but then like it once it's established. But how is the feel different in a garden that's more of the impressionistic, more randomized arrangement than a traditional garden?
Um, you know, I think traditional gardens kind of were more about, um, you know, collecting plants and showcasing them around a house and maybe creating walls with plants and maybe even showing some of our wealth, right? That we could afford to control nature, right? The French were big on this. And of course, they had indentured servitude. So they, you know, the kings could afford to do things like that. But, you know, the idea of taking cues from nature and trying to replicate some of those forms and experiences that we see in nature um, is really what these types of plantings to me are all about. Often I will show photos that I take of very spontaneous wild places as a supplement to our drawings to show people, you know, this is the eastern deciduous forest, and these are the forms of trunks that are not set perfectly on 25-foot centers apart from each other. You know, these trees are literally growing out of one another, and even my own team. I'm sure they thought I was crazy. As a matter of fact, they told me as such when I started putting trees in the same root ball. And I'm talking about big trees. In our own garden, we have trees like that. And I think it adds a real kind of relaxed, romantic feel when you see things like that, you know, especially as they start to grow together after a couple of years. And it does resonate with people. And so that's what I'm always looking at. And often, sometimes I see things that are beautiful, and it takes me a while to step back and look at the photo. I'm embarrassed to say, but I'll give you an example of that. I pulled over in the Pinelands in New Jersey, which is part of the coastal plain. It's a beautiful landscape. It's a massive preserve and state forest. And the fog was coming up early in the morning. This is about 7 in the morning. And I took these photos only to realize part of what I really love is the dead foliage of andropogon, little blue stem, from the year before that was growing out of these lush, dense layers of green grasses that were emerging mid-spring, right? And it really started me thinking about, oh, dead plants are beautiful, and last year's dead plants can still be beautiful. And that might sound ridiculous to some folks, right? But you can grow some bulbs or, you know, cool season forbs that look beautiful in the spring coming up against last year's, you know, little blue stem or broom sedge from last year. And even that can inform us about what we might find is beautiful, you know, those photos, those natural places, and trying to bring some of those things that are happening to nature to your garden. I think is a great it's been a great and exciting study for me, you know, something that I take great delight in for sure.
Yeah, sometimes you have to step back and say, what is it that draws me to this? Why do I like this scene? And
Yeah,
like you
all the
said,
time.
it's something unusual or something that's more natural than a formalized planting. Okay, well, we
Yes.
need to move along a little bit to phasing. Um, you know, not installing everything at once, moving through a plan. Um, and in your plan, you mentioned fracturing soils. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. I mean,
Benefits.
ideally, we try to leave the soil alone, right? We remove the turf grass if there's turf grass there, or the weeds. And if we see a lot of weed pressure, even if it's on the edges, sometimes we will just go in. We see things in particular like bindweed or like yellow nutsedge. These can be difficult to control a long time. So sometimes we'll go in, we'll make an assessment of the soil compaction, and we can do that with tools like penetrometers. Okay, but if you don't want to go and incur the expense of buying a penetrometer, which is a pretty simple tool that measures the pounds per square inch as we push down through the soil profile at any given depth. You can simply just start digging, into the soil and see, is that soil friable? Is it really tight? Does it feel like you're digging in concrete? If that's the case, you might need to go in with a pitchfork or a spade and just crack the soil. And that's what we try to use. We have these rippers that we pull on plows, and Rodale has a lot of information on using tools like this for, I don't know, 100 years. Permaculturists seem to have really embraced using this to improve compaction. And really, that's just ripping down deep into the soil profile and opening up these trenches so water and then air can go down. And it really kind of pulls all the soil apart, lower in the soil profile without mixing everything. The problem with tilling is kind of twofold. You degrade a lot of the physical components of soils, especially clay soils. Those components really help allowing water to drain through the soil profile. And once you break them down, right, once you send them through a screener that we do in kind of production topsoil, right, when we're buying topsoil in from a facility, that's all been screened. And it's really a degraded material at this point and not ideal to work with. We much rather work with some unscreened farm soil that's local if we can get our hands on it. But fracturing will really kind of open up the soil profile around you. Digging with a spade and just kind of cracking the soil can be a huge amenity in just opening up that soil profile. The other problem with tilling is typically the tine of the tiller will fracture the upper profile of the soil, but when it comes down and around, it actually will compact the lower profile of soil as that blade comes around. And so when we're really thinking about getting roots to grow deeply, the method of how you're decompacting is really, really important. We've even used things like backhoes where on a large scale, we crack into the soil, we just pull the soil up and drop it back down and then kind of smooth it back over. Or anything where we're literally just cracking and alleviating some of that compaction that often happens with construction, right? There's contractors in, they're pouring a foundation, the soil is wet, they're not going to slow down, and they're not really thinking about horticulture. And I don't blame them, that's not their job. But they're running heavy equipment over your lawn now. And you've been wondering why the weeds are growing and not your lawn or not some trees. And if you ever dig in around those plants, you might find that the soil is much like concrete. And how could roots grow in that condition? Or how can water even be expected to infiltrate through those soil profiles, right? So thinking about soil management is one of the most important things we do, making sure that's done. And again, often maybe 60% of the landscapes we work with, there's no problem. I mean, you don't have to think much about it. But on that percentage of gardens where we go in and we see there's extreme compaction, it's really critical that you start to manage soils first. And fracturing, it's just that. It's trying to open up the soil profile a little bit until the roots can get in and start to do that for you in the future.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And to not till and mix it together and you destroy that soil structure. That's really important that you mentioned in channeling that water downward. Really good point. And you also mentioned in your design about mulch, about not mulching annually. Can you explain why that's a recommendation? And then maybe talk a little bit about the notes that are here on the slide about types of mulch.
Sure. I mean, look, not all mulches are created equal, right? Production mulches typically are kind of a spent waste product from sawmills, or there are waste pallets that are ground up. Great source of carbon, right? But it's not the same as a kind of the dynamic mineral contents of the smaller caliper parts of a tree. And so then we love raw wood chips, which have a bad reputation from the ag industry and kind of these small scale farms where people were adding mulches, and the carbon is needing nitrogen to help the microbes in the soil break down that carbon. And so in a small annual crop, like a vegetable annual, maybe tomato or green, it's depleting short term the nitrogen source, right? And so your annuals are starving in the short term. And so not great to use those mulches in annual crops in ag. But for herbaceous plants, or more importantly, woody plants, we're trying to replicate succession in these suburban landscapes. And so we've changed what's happening. We don't have a forest dropping leaf litter and small parts of a tree through years and years, right? So now we're saying, okay, how do we replicate that? Let's just use some raw wood chips and maybe even leaf compost. And the good news is often you can get these for free from local municipal dumps, or even from local tree companies, or maybe even landscapers, or collect some leaves on your own. It doesn't need to be just that. Any kind of mixed natural biomass that's not processed, to me, it's more ideal. And we've seen it in our tree plantings, where we go really heavy with this kind of blend of wood chip, leaf compost. And then, we're not doing that year in and year out. I mean, you would never see that in nature, where we're depositing inches and inches of leaf compost and inches of wood chips. We can hold a lot of moisture on top of root flares, and up against herbaceous plants. And those plants don't want that. They want their crowns to dry out. Conversely, often what we do in compacted soils where we can't intervene, we might even throw small aggregate down around plants, because we see that the crowns drain better. And this might sound like an odd thing to do. And we see people, it was actually the folks at the University of Sheffield I mentioned earlier, they're doing that in rain gardens, where they're mulching the bottom of rain gardens with like a 3/8 inch aggregate. And the crowns of the plants, until they can establish, and maybe you even have compaction in the lower profile, maybe a contractor, when they were building these spaces, they compacted the subsoil inadvertently. But if you can get those crowns to establish by allowing them to drain a little bit, they can really start to take off. And so what we don't want to do is pile up a lot of biomass year in and year out. People wonder, oh, why did all my iris die? Or why are my grasses looking like they're rotting? Well, you're piling up years and years of mulch, and maybe worse, like a spent wood product, like triple ground hardwood mulch. It's not a dynamic type of biomass. Is it the worst thing to put down, for establishment? It's not the worst thing, but again, we like diversity. And what I mean by that are diverse parts of the tree. That's where all the energy is, you know, in the smaller, under a 2-inch caliper, you have a lot of mineralization in that wood mass. And so that's what we like to use. We get a lot of fungal growth in the leaf compost. I don't even think it's terrible to use for herbaceous plants. We use it often in our own gardens here, especially to cap the soil and to hold some moisture until those roots can establish. And then no more mulching. You know, if you're going to spend money and labor on mulches, just buy more plants and plant more densely. That's really the living mulch that you want. And that's what that ecology wants. You know, it wants that biomass breaking down and remulching the soil from year to year, and not the dense, coarse wood mulches for sure.
Yep. Getting back to your theme of dense plantings.
Yes.
The plants make the best mulch.
They do, for sure.
So in this design, or in any design, a lot of folks won't have the resources or the availability of plants or the time to install it all at once. So how do you recommend the phasing in of a design like the one you submitted?
Sure. Well, there's a couple ways. I mean, one is, you know, begging your buddy to let that you have some divisions from their plant, right? The other might be collecting some seed and growing some seed on, which is, you know, if you do a little reading, it's not the most difficult thing to do. Seeds really, it's exciting to, you know, wake up in the spring for some of these grasses and sedges and have these plants start to emerge. Often the forbs don't even need things like cold stratification. You can just sow them in the middle of the summer and they will grow. Excuse me. And so there's certainly collecting seed or buying some seed and growing your own plants on. There's division where you're going into your own garden or a friend's garden and starting to take some components or some vegetative divisions from their garden. There is buying bare root plants from some of these bare root growers, which is a much more affordable way to buy more plants and cheaper to ship than a containerized plant. And then there is understanding the competitive nature of some plants. And what I mean that by that is, you know, I bought my farm in 2008, a year before, or rather a year after I bought a home from my family. And then the market crashed and the farm was a huge expense to us. It was literally all the money I had saved for years. And yet I'm a gardener. So what was I going to do? Not put plants in the ground? That would be ridiculous. And so I decided I was going to put plants like Panicum virgatum, which grow quickly and large, and Agastache vorniculum, which from seed will be flowering the first year. Very showy plant and can replicate quickly. If you throw some aggregate down around that plant, it will start to seed into it quickly and spontaneously. Pycnanthum ammuticum, which from a 4-inch little plug in 1 year will be a 4-foot diameter plant, right? So if you have areas and you don't have a lot of resources and you're just trying to have some fun, you can certainly look at plants that might be more aggressive. And as your resources allow, maybe cull some of those plants out of your garden to add more diversity, right? But at least you have these exciting plants and this exciting experience of watching the panicum change color through the year and the beautiful textures of that plant in winter and how glorious it is when the frost sits on that in the morning and all the bees that a plant like Agastache or the Pycnanthemum will attract to a garden. So, you know, I guess the key is to be creative. You know, you could certainly collect seed from some spontaneous abandoned places. You're not really supposed to pick wildflowers and You don't want to go into a state forest and start pulling tons of seed out of it. But there are just kind of abandoned places. There's roadside edges where you can pick and collect seed. And, I think that's perfectly acceptable to go and grow seed on your own. So just being creative, I think, can go a long way in, allowing people without a lot of resource consumption to build and have beautiful places to live, for sure.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this has been great, Donald. Really appreciate you sharing your time and talent with us today, and sharing that design with Wild Ones to have on our website for people to enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you,
So
Dave.
Donald,
It's been a real pleasure. And if I can say one last thing, it's, don't wait another year. Put plants in the ground, just start planting. It's a really exciting way to live, and enjoy that process for sure.
awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. So
Sure,
Donald's Philadelphia design plant list and designer notes and a list of regional native plant nurseries can be found online at nativegardendesigns.wildones.org. And your feedback is welcome and helps us to continually improve webinars. So we ask that you please complete a short survey after viewing this program. So I want to thank you again, Donald, for joining us. And we hope the viewers are feeling inspired and empowered to plant more native plants in the community. So everybody have a fantastic day, and thank you for participating.